Okay, I'd like to first of all welcome you to our digital glaucoma support group today. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Philippa Mason and I am the Development Manager regionally in Scotland for Glaucoma UK. I'd also like to welcome our speaker today, Dr Andrew Tatham. Dr Tatham is a consultant ophthalmic surgeon who specialises in the treatment of glaucoma and cataracts at Edinburgh Eye Pavilion. Andrew has over 10 years of ophthalmology experience, and I've got here almost 50 publications, but that could have actually progressed since I've stolen this off another website, and is the past recipient of the UK and ERA Best Glaucoma Research Paper Award. As well as a highly respected surgeon and researcher, he is a wonderful supporter of Glaucoma UK, and I'm absolutely chuffed that Andrew's agreed to join us today for this webinar all about glaucoma research. Before starting, I'm just going to talk a little bit about how Zoom works. Just to let you know, guys, we cannot hear you and we cannot see you. You should be able to see myself and Andrew, and we may come on and off the screen when we're talking, but if you would like to communicate to us, we need you to write into the Q&A box if you have questions for us. And the way you get that up is if you wiggle your mouse or if you just touch your screen, you should have a bit that says Q&A. If you click on that, you can ask us a question. You can ask them throughout the session and I'll be able to see those questions. And at the end, we're having a 15-minute section where I will then put those questions to Andrew. Even if you don't want to ask a question or you think, oh, someone's already asked that question, there's an option on the Q&A where you can kind of click on it and like it. And if you do that, it kind of pushes that question up the list really of importance. And we can see it's more popular and have been asked by more than one person. And we'll try to come to those first. Okay, so Glaucoma UK, I'm sure some of you are aware of us, but if you're new to us, we are the UK's only charity for people with glaucoma or glaucoma-specific charity. And we work across three main strands to prevent glaucoma sight loss. Firstly, we campaign to raise awareness of the disease. We want people to know what glaucoma is and the importance of getting your eyes tested. Because of course, the earlier you get diagnosed with glaucoma, the more likely you are to retain useful sight for life. The second strand of our work is advice and support to people with glaucoma, but also for people who care for people with glaucoma. We have a variety of information leaflets, we have a helpline, we have a buddy service, and we have a patient forum. And we also provide training and advice to professionals and to people looking after people with glaucoma. And although we are a membership organisation, and you know, I'd encourage you if you can to join us, all these services are free to everybody to access. Finally, the third strand of our work is we fund research into the diagnosis, treatment, care and prevention of glaucoma. We're a small charity, we don't have huge amounts of money to throw into this, but we often provide initial funding for kind of seed research and early stage research to help get it going. Okay, so it's a little bit about us. I think that's probably all I want to say for now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand you over to Dr. Tatham. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this webinar today. I hope you'll find the next sort of 45 minutes or so interesting, and hopefully we can leave lots of time for questions. And firstly, a thank you to Philippa for arranging this and to Glaucoma UK for hosting it. Glaucoma UK are a fantastic organisation. I think research, as Philippa says, is a key part of the work that they do. And we've seen the power of research over the last year, haven't we, with the COVID situation, just how, you know, how much when resources are directed in the appropriately a certain problem, how much the scientific community can do to progress things. So let's focus on glaucoma then. And I'd like to start off by telling you a story about a doctor who was actually from Edinburgh called James Lint. And James Lint was a naval surgeon who conducted one of the first randomized trials published in medicine. And this was in the 1740s, when one of the major causes of death amongst sailors was the disease scurvy. And more sailors actually died from scurvy than died in battle. And at the time, it wasn't known what the cause was. So James Lint conducted an experiment where he treated 2 sailors with one of the proposed treatments, which was actually seawater. And then he treated another 2 with another proposed treatment, which was cider, and then another with oranges and lemons. I think one of the other proposed treatments was vinegar as well. And as we all now know, scurvy is due to lack of vitamin C. So it was the sailors that were fed oranges and lemons that recovered. And that really sort of set the precedence for how we should conduct clinical trials, having sort of a controlled experiment. Now, you might be wondering, why am I mentioning James Lint in a talk that's about glaucoma? Well, the James Lint Alliance is a really good organization which has borrowed his name. And this organization, their primary purpose is to look at what are the most important research questions. And the best people to answer that are people who actually have the conditions that we're trying to research, also their carers and people looking after them as well. So the James Lint Alliance looks at all types of diseases and sets these priorities for research. And in 2013, they had a session where they looked at sight loss, and part of that was looking at glaucoma. And they invited about 5,000 people to submit the questions that they thought were not fully answered, the most important questions, and then had a focus group where they came up with a list of the top 10. And these were the top 10 questions for glaucoma. So number 1 was, what are the most effective treatments and how can the treatments be improved? Number 2 was, how can loss of vision from glaucoma be restored? Number 3, how can we stop glaucoma from progressing, which means getting worse? Number 4, what can be done to improve early diagnosis of sight-threatening glaucoma? Because as we know, most people who have glaucoma have a very low risk of losing a significant amount of vision. But what we really need to do is better to detect and predict those people are at greatest risk. So that is an important question. Number 5, people are interested in knowing what causes glaucoma. And then there are other questions. From 6 to 10, there were questions about what's the best way to monitor the disease. Is the best way really that every 6 months you attend a hospital and have visual field tests? Is that really the best way? They also had questions about how we should detect those at higher risk. Why is glaucoma more aggressive in people of certain ethnic groups? How can you prevent glaucoma? And then lastly, I think was a very interesting question about, is there a link between adhering to treatment and progression, and how can we actually improve adherence? So those were the top 10 questions back in 2013. And I'd be interested to know, perhaps if you have any questions you think might be more important, perhaps you could submit those as a question. But what I thought might be interesting to do was to look at, have we made any progress since 2013? And what's sort of the future direction in trying to answer some of these questions? So when we think about research, we think about often clinical trials. So we can sort of divide research into the basic research that happens in a laboratory, and then things that are a little bit closer to being implemented in clinical practice. So those trials in real life people. And there's lots of letters associated with these trials. So we sometimes refer to it as an alphabet soup. And since 2013, though, there have been 4 really quite important studies that have made their way onto this sort of timeline of the key glaucoma trials. So it might be quite useful just to recap some of those. So the first, or I should probably say as well, that out of those 4, 3 were conducted in the UK. So I think we should be proud of that. But the first is the UK Glaucoma Treatment Study, or the UK GTS. Now, this was a study that was led by Moorfields, by Professor Garway Heath, who is the Glaucoma UK professor. And this was the first study to actually compare a current treatment, which was latanoprost, a common eye drop, and they compared that to placebo. So basically a drop of harmless water type material. And they randomized people to either latanoprost or the placebo and followed them up over time. And we found in this study that lowering eye pressure helps preserve vision. The second important thing was that many people were actually at low risk of losing vision. So the study lasted for 2 years, and even those people who had placebo, so they were not having an actual treatment, even those people had quite a low risk of losing vision. About 2/3 of them didn't lose significant vision over the 2 years despite having placebo. Now, having said that, there are a group of people who progress quickly. But I think this shows that often people have anxiety when they're diagnosed with glaucoma, and sometimes that doesn't match with reality. And sometimes the risk of losing vision can actually be quite low. Another important finding of the study is that the study was quite short. It was for 2 years, and previous studies of glaucoma had lasted many, many years because glaucoma is usually a slow disease. But this study showed that you can actually conduct useful clinical trials of glaucoma in a fairly short time period. So that was the UK GTS. The second landmark study that we've had, which was also led from, this was led from Belfast, and this was the EAGLE study. So this was looking at people with angle closure glaucoma. So this has a different mechanism to the most common type of glaucoma, open angle glaucoma, and the treatments are different. And before this study, we didn't really know whether the best treatment was laser. So that was the traditional treatment where we would make a tiny laser hole in the iris, the colored part of the eye, to help open up the drainage angle, lower the pressure, protect the eye. We didn't know if that was the best treatment, or the alternative treatment would be removing the lens in the eye. So that's similar to a cataract operation, but it's performing the operation before someone's actually got cataracts, while they still have a clear lens. And by removing the lens, that also helps open up the drainage angle because it creates more space in the eye. So in this study, people who had primary angle closure glaucoma were randomized to have laser or to have a lens extraction or a clear lens extraction. And the study found, so this is a picture there of a laser iridotomy, the laser treatment that was performed, making a tiny hole in the iris. And the key finding of the study was that patients who had clear lens extraction overall had better quality of life. They were on fewer eye drops and had lower pressure than people who had laser iridotomy. So the conclusion of the study was that we can consider clear lens extraction as a first-line treatment for people with angle closure glaucoma. So that was an important study. That changed the types of treatment we were considering and offering for this particular type of glaucoma. Now, the third of those landmark studies also looked at angle closure, but it looked at patients who hadn't yet developed angle closure glaucoma. So those that were at risk of developing it. And this was a study that was conducted in China, and it had almost 900 people. And in this study, rather than randomize individual patients to different treatments, one person had different treatments in each eye. So one eye was treated with the laser iridotomy, the other eye was not treated and was observed. And this was a long study. This was a study that lasted 6 years. And it was a long study because very few people actually progressed and developed angle closure glaucoma. So important conclusions of this study were that in the past, if somebody had a narrow drainage angle and they were thought at risk of getting angle closure glaucoma, we'd pretty much always perform a laser iridotomy. But this showed that actually in this group of patients, the risk was quite low. And so perhaps not treating is an option and just monitoring. Now we have to remember though that this was in people in China, so it might be slightly different in other populations, but again, a very important study. Now the last of these landmark studies is the LIGHT trial, which is a study looking at another type of laser called SLT, or selective laser trabeculoplasty. And in this study, they looked at people who had just been diagnosed with glaucoma, this time open angle glaucoma, the most common type in the UK, or people who just had high pressure in their eyes, who didn't yet have glaucoma, so we call that ocular hypertension. And patients had either SLT, the laser treatment, or latanoprost, one of the common eye drop. And interestingly, at 3 years, almost 3/4 of people who had the laser treatment first still didn't need latanoprost, they didn't need eye drops, which I think was a better result than people expected. And importantly, we also learned that SLT is more cost effective for the NHS than using eye drops. So these type of studies, they take a lot of organization, they take a lot of funding, and they take time. But there's been real progress since 2013 and since those questions were posed by the James Lint Alliance. But if we look at what questions have these addressed, well, I think they've addressed question 1 partially. What are the most effective treatments? Certainly they've helped with that. And I think they've helped with question 3. How can glaucoma be stopped or at least slowed in its progression? But what about question 2? How can loss of vision be restored for people with glaucoma? Haven't really looked at that. And that's because treatments that help restore vision are not really ready, largely, for clinical trials. These are far more focused on laboratory type research. They're an earlier stage. And this is a branch of medicine called regenerative medicine. And then broadly, this is defined as a group of medicine that helps to regrow, to repair, or to replace damaged or diseased cells. So in glaucoma, the primary part of the eye that is damaged, that could really benefit from regeneration, is the optic nerve. Now, the optic nerve is quite complicated, though. It's a complicated structure because it goes from the back of our eye all the way into the brain. But another potential target is the drainage channel in the eye, the trabecular meshwork, because glaucoma is, in most people, related to the pressure in the eye, often raised pressure in the eye. And that's due to a plumbing problem where the water in the eye can't drain away through the trabecular meshwork. So if there was a way to regenerate that, to restore the function of the trabecular meshwork and lower pressure, that would also be of benefit. So if we think about the optic nerve, to regenerate the optic nerve, essentially we would need to make the retinal cells grow back into the brain. And that is a challenge because the length that those nerves would need to travel, and also they'd need to travel to the right place. They'd need to be directed. So that sounds a tough challenge, but there are studies that show that it might be possible. Now this looks a bit like modern art, but the green picture there is actually the retinal ganglion cells. These are the cells that go from the retina through the optic nerve to the brain. These are the cells that are damaged in glaucoma. And in this particular study, they were able to transplant retinal ganglion cells into a retina. And in some cases, those cells were able to grow through the optic nerve and reach the right sites in the brain. Now, these are studies that not in humans yet, but they're interesting and they show the potential. So I think there is hope, but it's still quite some way off. Maybe the trabecular meshwork and restoring function in the trabecular meshwork could be easier. And there's again encouraging early studies, again in the laboratory, but showing that this might be a possibility. And one way to do this is by using stem cells. Now, it's incredible that you can take some skin from anybody, take some skin cells, and in the laboratory, you can feed it the right materials and you can convert that skin into a cell, a trabecular meshwork cell. And then that trabecular meshwork cell could be implanted into the eye to help restore the function, help improve the drainage. So there's some exciting work going on. It's still quite a way from clinical studies in people, but I think it's very encouraging. Now, before we've said that growing the retinal ganglion cells, sorry for the abbreviations, RGCs, retinal ganglion cells. We're always guilty as doctors, aren't we, of abbreviating things, but those before retinal ganglion cells actually die, as they do in glaucoma, they become sick. And while they're sick, there is an opportunity perhaps that we might be able to nurse them and help them recover. And although lowering the pressure in the eye can certainly do that, it can help nourish those retinal ganglion cells, there are other ways that we can do that. And that's referred to often as neuroprotection, or if the cells actually recover, neurorecovery. So that might, if we can have some neurorecovery, that might actually restore vision a little bit. And this complicated table here, basically, it shows that there's quite a few. Each of those lines represents different studies of potential neuroprotective treatments that are either finished or currently underway. There's quite a few different pieces of work going on. But in the last 12 months, an interesting area is looking at some more commonly available substances, vitamins, for instance, that might be neuroprotective. And these are quite interesting because they're readily available, they're very cheap. And one such substance is nicotinamide, not nicotine, but nicotinamide, which is a type of vitamin B3. And nicotinamide is really important for helping energy production within the cells in our body. And this year, a group in Australia has published a study in a small number of people. It was only 49 people. So I don't think we can, wholeheartedly recommend this, certainly not yet, but it's very interesting. And in this study, they gave people nicotinamide tablets, so not eye drops, tablets, for a 12-week period. And after 12 weeks, they compared the tablets to placebo, and then patients crossed over after those 12 weeks. And in most studies of glaucoma, we look and we see what's happening to the visual field, so the peripheral vision test, what's happening to the pressure. But in this study, they used a different technique where they measured the electrical activity of the retina. And this might be a new interesting way to measure glaucoma. But they found that taking nicotinamide actually improved the function of the retina in this fairly small group of people. But I think this is a very interesting area. It'd be good to see bigger studies looking at nicotinamide. So those are a few suggestions perhaps of how loss of vision might be improved or restored, but there is still quite a lot a way to go in that. What about question 4? What can be done to improve early diagnosis of sight-threatening glaucoma? Well, an interesting area is genetics. And I think this is something that's certainly within touch. I think this is going to change how we estimate the risk of somebody losing vision from glaucoma in the not too distant future. And unlike some other diseases where there's a single genetic mutation that is really the only reason for that person getting the disease, glaucoma is more complicated than that. There's only about 5% of people who have glaucoma who have a single genetic mutation that's caused it. And those people normally get glaucoma at a very young age. So most glaucoma is due to a combination of multiple genetic and environmental factors. And in fact, there's over 100 genetic locations have been identified that could contribute to glaucoma. So there are tests now where we can identify these genetic locations. And not only might they help identify those who are more risk of losing vision, maybe it will mean that those that are lower risk don't need to be seen so often. So perhaps people will be able to have their genetic risk for glaucoma tested, and then we might be able to say, well, actually, you're at very low risk. You might only need to come to have your eyes checked every 2 years rather than every 6 months. So I think there's a potential for that, and there are already companies that offer genetic testing that you can just arrange online. People do this at home, and they're becoming cheaper and cheaper. So it might be that in the future, it becomes more common that people just have, perhaps on a memory stick, their genetic code, and it's easier to analyze for not just glaucoma, for all sorts of diseases. Of course, there are ethical implications to this as well. But this, again, I'm not recommending these. I'm not saying go out and do this, certainly not. But this particular company, they actually have a test. They can give you a risk score for age-related macular degeneration. They don't have it for glaucoma yet. And I think we need to be very careful with these sort of things as well, because having a genetic test without somebody who understands it and able to interpret it, and some of these things even ophthalmologists don't fully understand. You need a genetic specialist to understand. So I think there are potential problems with this, but I think looking at this sort of genetic information in the future is very interesting. Another thing that could help us detect and identify those people who are at high risk of losing vision from glaucoma is better understanding the risk factors we already measure. So of course, we tend to focus on pressure, and sometimes we focus on that too much and we overemphasize it because it's not really the most important thing. The most important thing is vision and maintaining the vision. And there's real problems with how we measure pressure at the moment, because we just get a snapshot of pressure. You might get your pressure checked once or twice a year, but pressure fluctuates. It's a bit like blood pressure, it fluctuates quite a bit. So just having isolated pressure measurements can not always be that useful. What's more important is looking to see whether vision changes over time. But there are new methods that might be useful in the future that are currently being researched. And one of these is home monitoring. Now, when we think about other conditions like diabetes, diabetes management relies on home monitoring. And we're quite behind in glaucoma, really. But there are now ways that people can check their pressure at home. So there is a device called the iCare Home, which allows somebody to measure their pressure. That's a picture of it there on the right. And there are increasing numbers of studies that show that home monitoring can give reliable pressure measurements and can give measurements that are quite close to those in the clinic. But I think what we still need research to do is to see when is it most useful. It might not be very helpful if we become obsessed with taking lots of pressure measurements. They don't really change what we're doing, or if we don't know how to interpret them. And we don't, because we're used to having isolated measurements. We don't really know what's the most important pressure measurement. Is it the highest pressure you get, the lowest, the range, the variability? Still not really sure about that. But having the ability to take more measurements will allow us to research that and answer those questions. Now, the pandemic, of course, has created its own problems in terms of people not being monitored as they should. And I think that also has the opportunity for research, and it perhaps pushes us more towards home monitoring. So something we've been doing recently, we have a patient who travels from Shetland sometimes down to see us. And so we posted them this self pressure measuring device, and we're able to call them very much as we are now, have a mini webinar and show them how to use it remotely. And then they were able to relay their pressure readings back to us. So I think more research is needed to see whether this might be useful, whether people can actually do it. But it's an interesting area. Another area of research in terms of pressure is sensors. So sensors can be inserted into the eye that allow you to measure pressure. So this person here in the middle has a device where they hold it up in front of their eye, and the device will actually tell them their pressure. So they can measure it as much as they like. Again, maybe this will make us focus too much on pressure when it isn't the most important thing to measure, but it can give us a large number of measurements. So this wiggly red line here shows the pressure measurements that somebody has taken over just 1 month. And they took 69 measurements in just a month. But these sort of things are interesting. I think more research is needed before they enter the mainstream. Maybe they won't. Maybe measuring other things at home would be more useful. But I think it's quite exciting, because I think there might be a time where we can actually have a tiny sensor. Perhaps somebody having cataract surgery might have a tiny sensor on their lens that's put into their eye at the time of cataract surgery, and then that could tell a glaucoma drainage device, does it need to lower the pressure more? And it could open or close depending on the pressure measured in the eye. So these are interesting things, and something that has been trialed recently is a device called the iWatch, which is it's a little plastic tube that's put into the eye to help drain fluid, drain the water, lower the pressure, and the how open or closed the little tube is can be controlled with a magnetic dial. So this gives some control over pressure. It's quite a big, major operation though, so it's for people with very severe glaucoma, but there are new surgical devices being developed as well. So sticking with home monitoring, I mentioned home pressure monitoring, but I think something that might be more exciting, more useful is home visual field testing, because we know how horrible the current visual field test is. We know that people hate putting their head into a bowl, having to concentrate for what can sometimes feel like 20 minutes, sometimes longer, on looking at one spot, pressing a button when you see the spot. A visual field test is not very pleasant. And because it takes a lot of time and it needs to be done in either an optometrist or a hospital, it can't be done very often. And so that can make it difficult to track whether vision is changing or not. Now, there are a couple of devices that are being evaluated using iPads or laptops, where people could check their visual fields at home. And that might enable more visual field measurements and potentially less visits to hospital. And I think this is an area that is very exciting. And over the next few years, hopefully we'll see some development in this area. Also, the cost of visual field testing will come down because it can be done on cheaper, readily available equipment. And we are part in Edinburgh, we're part of a study that's just about to start looking at the feasibility of home glaucoma monitoring, intraocular pressure and visual field monitoring, which is happening in Nottingham, Belfast and Edinburgh, led from the University of Aberdeen. So over the next year or so, hopefully we'll be able to report back with some of the results from this. Now, another interesting thing is a technique called DARK, and this could also help us detect people who are more risk of glaucoma and losing vision from glaucoma. Now, DARK stands for Detection of Apoptosis Retinal Ganglion Cells. That's a mouthful for me as well, but apoptosis basically means dying, and the retinal ganglion cells are those cells in the retina that are affected by glaucoma. So this is actually a technique where a special dye is injected into the back of the hand and travels up into the eye, and photographs are taken. And they're very hard to see, but there's little white spots on that photo that are circled in blue and green. And those little spots are actually the cells that are dying glowing. So you can count how many cells are dying. And that can give us an idea of what's happening in the retina, what's happening in glaucoma. So this is a very interesting method. It's slightly invasive because it takes an injection, but I think I wanted to show this just to illustrate how there are new techniques for imaging and assessing damage from glaucoma. Very briefly, I thought it'd be also worthwhile talking about artificial intelligence, because that is a hot topic across all types of walks of life, and glaucoma is no exception. Now, this is a photograph of the back of an eye, a photograph of a retina and optic nerve. And looking at this photograph, I could tell you that it's a right eye, and I could tell you that that person doesn't have glaucoma, but I can't tell you much else about that person. But artificial intelligence, so using a computer to recognize images, can tell you a lot more, and it can actually work out how old that person is, what sex they are, whether they smoke, and even their blood pressure, just from that image. And I don't know how. It's about pattern recognition and a very clever computer. But there's quite a lot of groups looking at this and looking at what can be gleaned from a photograph or an image of the eye. And artificial intelligence can predict whether you're at risk of getting a heart problem just from a photograph by looking at these risk factors that I just mentioned: blood pressure, age, sex, whether you smoke or not. Things that ophthalmologists and optometrists really can't tell from looking at a photograph. And I think that's exciting, because in glaucoma, it's in glaucoma, if artificial intelligence could take if you could take a photograph and a computer could say yes or no, you've got glaucoma, or your risk of glaucoma is high or not, that could be very useful, because it could help people have their glaucoma detected earlier. If somebody goes to their optometrist and has a photograph, you have to be very, very trained to look at a photograph and be able to tell whether that person is at risk of glaucoma. But if a computer can help you and help prompt you whether that person needs further investigations, it could be very useful. And there are some early studies looking at this, and they've shown that a computer can do as well as a glaucoma specialist at detecting glaucoma from photographs. So another very interesting area of research. So I think we've looked at some of these questions. I just wanted to very briefly go back to question one: what's the most effective treatments for glaucoma? And when we think about glaucoma treatments, for most people, it involves eye drops. And I don't need to tell you about what the problems that people can have with eye drops. Some people can't put them in. Some people, most people actually don't always take them. And people have looked at different diseases where people have to take medication every day. And glaucoma has people who are least adherent, and it's because the drops make the eyes red, they can make the eyes feel dry. Most people with glaucoma don't feel they have a problem. They're not aware of the loss of vision, and so not everyone then has the motivation to continue taking treatment. So there are lots of issues around it. They are really difficult to use, and I think these problems often go unrecognized, because I think doctors, we're often quite bad at really asking people the right questions to see whether they have a problem. And some people would take their drops for the week before their appointment, and because they know then that they're reminded that they have an appointment, they have glaucoma, they need to take their drops. So we never really realise that they're not using them. So it's not surprising perhaps that about 45% of people would accept a slightly more invasive approach than an eye drop if it helped decrease or avoid the use of eye drops. So what potential new ways of delivering medicines to the eye are there? Well, something that we've been researching in Edinburgh as part of an international study is an implant. And this is an implant which is inserted into the front chamber of the eye. And the implant there is pictured right in the middle. It's very, very tiny. It's not much bigger than a few grains of sand. It's really tiny. And this implant has a medication called bimatoprost, which is of the same family of drugs as latanoprost, bimatoprost, travoprost. So if you have glaucoma, the chances are you've had a drop that ends in prost. It's the most common family of drugs. And this implant has the same amount of bimatoprost as a single eye drop. But it can have a very long-lasting effect. So the implant is inserted into the front chamber of the eye, and then it sinks to the bottom of the eye. It's not visible, and it slowly dissolves over time and releases the medication, the bimatoprost. And this year, the results of a clinical study called Artemis were published in Ophthalmology, which is one of the top ophthalmology publications, journals. And apologies, this is the only slide that has a complicated sort of graph on it, but really, if you can make out the numbers on it on the top right hand side, have I got a pointer? There we go. Top right hand side, there's some percentages, and what these percentages show is the proportion of people who are not needing eye drops after having this implant, and it's 1 year after having the implant. So, so patients in this study, they had up to 3 of these implants over a course of time. So they'd have one implant, and then when the implant was wearing off, they'd have another, and they could have up to 3. And although the implant dissolves and releases the medication, and all the medication has been released after about 3 to 4 months, it can have a very long-lasting effect. And so on the final column there, in about 82 to 88% of people, so 8 out of 10 to 9 out of 10 people, a year after having their last implant, still didn't need any eye drops. So it could have a longer lasting effect. So I think this is very interesting and very exciting. It certainly wouldn't be suitable for everyone. There is obviously a slight risk with having something implanted into the eye compared to an eye drop. But the study also showed that some of the side effects were much less. So people were less likely to get longer eyelashes and redness around the eye, and a red eye, the kind of side effects that can happen with eye drops. But certainly not everyone would feel that happy to have an implant. And I think certainly the vast majority of people will still use drops or other options. But there are other things being explored. So this is called a punctal plug. So it's a plug that's put into the tear duct. And the plug is just inserted into the tear duct, and it slowly releases the medication over time. And so there are other ways, less invasive ways, that we could deliver the medications. So I hope that's been interesting. I know glaucoma research is a huge topic, and there is far more going on than I've been able to mention today. And I think it's great, really. It's encouraging to see the progress being made towards answering these really important questions. I think there's still a way to go, but we are making progress. And I'd like to thank you very much for tuning in. I hope nobody's had any reception problems. And if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to do my best to try and answer them. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Andrew, for that absolutely excellent presentation. You've managed to fit a lot in a very short amount of time, which is amazing. And absolutely, we've got loads of questions that have come through from everybody. So I'm going to start making my way through some of those, so be prepared. The first question today, and I think you covered some of this in your talk, but it's just if you've got anything to add, really. We had a email question earlier on asking about research done on developing a reliable and affordable home tonometer that can accommodate different corneal thicknesses and when it will be available in the UK. And we touched on some of the kind of at-home use. And someone on Facebook also asked how quickly you think we'll see these type of things coming into the mainstream and used at home. I mean, how far are we from kind of concept and experiment into actually getting people getting their hands on it?
Yeah, well, the device that I showed you a picture of, it's called the iCare Home. Probably many people are familiar with the iCare because this is, we think about how we check pressure, and often we think of a puff of air. So opticians often use puff of air tests, or we think of what the gold standard way at the moment is still called Goldman Tonometry. So that's where you'd have an eye drop put in, a drop of anesthetic, a little bit of yellow dye, and then a blue prism, a blue probe really comes very close to your eye and it just touches the surface very gently. So that's still the gold standard, and I think that it will take a lot actually to show that something is reliable as that. Now the other way of checking pressure that we're using increasingly is for years we've said the air puff test is not very good, but there is actually an air puff test that that actually is very good, because as you mentioned in the question, that's obviously somebody very informed about the cornea, because when we're measuring pressure, the pressure measurements are affected by the cornea, by the thickness of the cornea, but also by the elasticity of the cornea. And so there is a device, it's called the Ocular Response Analyzer, and that is an air puff. But that actually is probably even better than the Goldman. So I would say the two sort of gold standard tests are the Goldman and the Ocular Response Analyzer. Now, home monitoring, at the moment, the only tool is the iCare Home, which has this little probe that bounces off the eye, and that's already available. And it's already been shown that the measurements are fairly comparable to those other two tests. But I think the big question is it useful? And are measuring pressure at home really useful? Because I think we try to get people not to focus too much on the pressure, because the pressure isn't the most important thing, because some people with glaucoma have a low pressure and they still lose some vision. And other people have very high pressure and they're absolutely fine. So what's more important, I think, is focusing on the vision and how you feel, visual field. So yeah, sorry, long-winded answer to that question, but I think it is available, but is it right? I think it's worth talking to your ophthalmologist about, perhaps. It hasn't entered the mainstream yet. So more research needed. That's probably the answer to all these questions. More research needed.
Absolutely, more research. And one of the things that actually leads on to, because you were talking about, you know, the fact that sometimes pressure doesn't actually indicate, you know, the kind of where your glaucoma might be. This leads us into a question that's come through on our Zoom right at the beginning, which is, do you know of any kind of new research into normal tension glaucoma? Or
Yeah, well, normal tension glaucoma is an interesting condition. I mean, some people will say, is it different to other types of glaucoma? Is it really a distinct disease? And I think it might not be, you know, because I mean, if you have glaucoma, so when you say a normal pressure is between 10 and 21. So if you've got glaucoma and your pressure is 22, is that really a different disease? So if you have glaucoma and your pressure is 19, when the pressures fluctuate a bit anyway, it probably isn't. So I think some people with normal, what we call normal pressure glaucoma, is probably exactly the same process, and the damage is due to the pressure. Other people, perhaps there are other factors, and I think one of the most important things about normal pressure glaucoma is lowering the pressure is still the best treatment. So there's a study called the normal pressure glaucoma study, and they found that even if you've got low pressure, lowering the pressure more helps. But undoubtedly there are other factors that, and we don't fully understand them, but I touched on them perhaps with the genetics, and I think the genetics will really help us here, because things that are important include the blood flow to the eye. There are little parts of our cells called mitochondria, which are really important for energy production, and that we're knowing that they're very important too. And as we understand more about the genetics, we'll be able to say, look, this specific genetic factor, this risk factor, is a risk factor for glaucoma, and then we might say why. And if it's not a gene for pressure, if it's a gene for the blood flow to the eye or mitochondria, that could be really helpful, because it could give us a new way to treat the problem as well. We could target that. So I think the most exciting studies in normal pressure glaucoma are probably the genetic studies, actually, because they tell us about the reasons, the mechanisms behind the damage.
and as you said, more research required.
Yes.
In all of these things, absolutely. I've got a question here about you. You spoke about vitamin B3 earlier on, and people were saying, you know, is it something you could eat more of? You know, if you ingest it, would it have a positive effect on you? And what kind of things have B3 in them?
Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't know much about vitamin B3 before this study, and nicotinamide, though, is just one type of vitamin B3. So there are different components of vitamin B3, and in the study, I think it's important to realize, you know, it's 49 people. So this is not a big study. You know, if you have, we know from the COVID study, vaccine study, you need a large number of people to get reliable information. So 49 is not really enough to know. But and the dose that people were treated with is actually quite high. So they took the nicotinamide, not just B3, nicotinamide, and there are potential side effects, even though it's a naturally occurring substance. Taking it for a long period of time, there could be potential side effects. And in the study, people took this very high dose for 12 weeks. And we don't know, is 12 weeks enough? What happens after those 12 weeks? Does the effect wear off? How long do you need to take it for? Is there a lower dose? They didn't look at different doses and see, does a lower or higher dose actually help? So I think at the moment, again, it's hard to. I'm not sure I'd advocate taking it at the moment. I think but I'm excited about bigger studies, and I think there will be bigger studies looking at this. And if I think we're still looking, if it's encouraging, because I think this is the best evidence we have yet for something that could be neuroprotective. So helping glaucoma by not just by lowering the pressure in the eye.
Absolutely. And you know, often with research, what comes is more questions, isn't it? More questions and more questions, but that's the start, and hopefully it carries on. I've got
I think, Philippa, one thing though, sometimes I think when you see what more research is needed, it feels like we haven't really made much progress, but we have. And I think that you can see from those clinical trials actually how it's actually changed what we do. Researchers, now when we see somebody who has just found out they've got glaucoma, we say to them, would you like laser? Would you like SLT? because we've got really good data from a really good study. So although I think more research is needed in some of the in areas. There's always other questions, but we're making really good progress actually.
Absolutely. To be able to see the kind of progress that we've got to so far, and as human beings, you know, we're always so hungry. So we get to one stage and then we think, that's great. What's next? What's around the corner? And then what's after that? Which is wonderful. But yeah, absolutely, the kind of progress that's been made in the last 10 years is unbelievable, really. Got a question here come through on Zoom, and this one says, monitoring is clearly important. They're saying about visual field is a lag measure, and you know, the only lead measure is pressure, they were saying, you know. Are there any other lead measures that are being looked at in terms of research?
Well, that's a really nice way of viewing it, and I think that's absolutely right, because visual field and looking at the optic nerve, it tells you what's happened, not about the future. So I mean, the in some people though, because glaucoma is very slow, and if you can pick glaucoma up at an early stage, then actually seeing what happens over a period of time is quite useful, something we do a lot of. So looking at the visual field over the past can actually be a lead measure as well, because it can help you predict where you're heading if the treatment isn't changed. So I'd say that, yeah, it is primarily looking at the past, but it does really, I think it's the best way of predicting the future. But yeah, I can see what you mean. In some people, we don't want to wait. You know, if you've got quite bad glaucoma, you certainly don't want to rely on looking at the visual fields and predicting where you're going to be. You need to look at the risk factors. And so pressure is important. I think apart from pressure, trying to predict the future, we again, the genetics will be helpful. Looking at the corneal hysteresis, properties of the cornea as well is quite useful. But yeah, there's a lot more that could be done to try and better predict the future. Most of our predictions about the future are by looking at what's happened in the past.
Excellent, absolutely, learning those lessons as well. I've just got a couple of questions that are kind of coming through about particular types, I suppose, of glaucoma and research into those areas, which you may or may not know of. So don't worry, don't feel under any pressure. Someone's asked about, is there much research going into pseudo exfoliation glaucoma? Something that's come up quite a lot in our forums, and I think we've arranged I think it will be in May, we're going to have a talk specifically about that. But yeah, do you know of any research into?
Yeah, well, that's a really important type of glaucoma, because that we know that people have pseudo exfoliation. The glaucoma tends to be slightly more aggressive. It tends to worsen slightly more quickly. So it's a type of glaucoma that we do try to concentrate on, and it's also very strongly genetic component to it as well, and it's one of the few types of glaucoma where we can actually see the reason for the glaucoma. We can see why the pressure is high, because for those of you that aren't aware what it is, pseudo exfoliation gives you a sort of white fluffy material inside the eye that blocks up the drain. You can actually see why the pressure is high. Now, in terms of research, the primary research again in pseudo exfoliation is looking at the genetics. And there are new genes that have been discovered for it recently. And these genes have been discovered by huge international collaborations involving 50, 60 countries with thousands of patients. And so it's I think what that's shown me, we were one small site. We had about 20 people we had with pseudo exfoliation to look at their genetics. But it shows me how collaboration is so important in glaucoma research. You can't do it on your own. You need huge numbers of people, and you need. Thankfully, we have people who are really, really kind and want to take part in research. People who will come in for extra visits and have extra tests, and we're just so grateful for people that give up time to help us with research. And so I hope that answers the question. I think genetics is pseudo exfoliation genetics is interesting. But I suppose another thing about pseudo exfoliation is perhaps if you can see the cause, it might be that we can reduce the amount of material that people are developing. Maybe there'll be some way to switch off that trigger that causes the pseudo exfoliation material to develop. But it's a very interesting, very important type of glaucoma.
Absolutely. And as I said, because we've kind of been responding to a few requests from people who have mentioned that particular type of glaucoma, and we are planning to have a talk specifically about that in May. I just want to do one more question, or one more area really that people have mentioned, and that's about research being done into congenital glaucoma. Also on Facebook, someone asked, is there any hope for young people who are diagnosed with open-angle glaucoma in the early stage to maintain their vision for the rest of their life? So do you know anything about kind of research in this area?
Well, we're quite subspecialized now, even within glaucoma. So there are people who specialize in congenital glaucoma, and I'm not one of those people. But I do know that if you develop glaucoma in childhood, then again, a very strong genetic component is likely. So I think there's a lot of interest in exploring why that happens. I mean, a large number of people as well who develop childhood glaucoma, it's a result of having cataracts, congenital cataracts. So some children who are born with cataracts and have cataract surgery at an early age have a very high rate of getting glaucoma. So improving sort of surgical techniques and the timing of surgery in terms of cataract surgery, that can help. And I think that with congenital glaucoma, there has been a lot of development in the surgery for it, because whereas most types of glaucoma, the vast majority of people with glaucoma never need an operation. But if you are born with glaucoma, you will need an operation. And actually an operation can, about 50% of people, it can almost cure it. But in those 50% of people where it doesn't, that's where there's a real challenge. So yeah, congenital glaucoma is very different. It's almost a completely different disease.
Absolutely. Well, what we're trying to do as well is we've had a few requests at Glaucoma UK for talks on congenital, so we're sorting that out as well, and hopefully we'll have something specific for a whole session. And I just want to say as well, you mentioned very briefly about people coming forward and being involved in research and how important that is to us kind of progressing forward. For World Glaucoma Week this year, one of the talks that we're hoping to have is with people who have actually taken part in research for glaucoma, and they'll be telling their stories, hopefully to encourage other people to volunteer and to be part of that as well. So, we're hearing about research from the clinician and from the researcher side, and hopefully we'll be able to hear it from the volunteers and participants side as well. Andrew, thank you. I mean, there are more questions. What I want to say is, obviously, I want to keep us to time as much as I possibly can. If we haven't managed to answer your question today, please talk to us at the helpline, email us, and we can let you know. We can even ask Andrew if he doesn't mind us. If we don't know the answers, we will ask Andrew, and that would be wonderful. I'm just going to ask very quickly now, just to launch my second poll. As I said, it's really useful for us to know whether you found how useful you found this, and let me just get that up and going. Launch polling, and if you can tell us what you thought, and let us know now how you're feeling about how much you know about glaucoma research. I'm going to leave that up for just a second, and when that's done, I've got one more slide, guys, and I'm not going to keep you long, I promise. Wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful. Minimize that for now. Okay, so just my final slide, guys, just to be able to kind of finish off for today. Here we go. Let me just share this. Okay. First of all, Andrew, thank you so much. There's not a day goes past at this work that I don't learn the most amazing things, and it gives me so much hope hearing about the developments in so many different areas. And thank you so much for being so precise about going over them in such a short amount of time. It's been a real eye-opener in finding out about so much. So thank you so much for giving up your time for that today. Everybody, thank you so much for coming along today. I hope you found it useful. What I want to leave you with is our page here with contact details. This has our helpline details on it, also has our email address. Our helpline's open from 9:30 till 5, Monday to Friday. So if there's anything we can help with, please give us a shout. Our next digital support group will be taking place on the 8th of February at 6 o'clock. That's going to be titled, "Why are my glaucoma appointments now taking place at my local opticians?" If you'd like to be part of that talk, please register on Zoom, and you can do that at our website, glaucoma.uk. I just want to say a couple of final things, a little heads up really. Glaucoma UK are looking for people who want to also be involved in a peer-to-peer support pilot that we're trying to get up and running. The aim of these groups is to offer space online or by telephone for people with glaucoma who are going through similar experiences and may want to chat and discuss these experiences. If you're interested in being part of this pilot, we'd love to have you on board. So drop us a note on our website and we'll get back to you. Finally, I'm going to send you a Survey Monkey at the end of all of this. So please help us by filling that in and letting us know what you thought of the webinar. We want these sessions to be as great as possible. So the more feedback we receive, the better. Andrew, thank you once again. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.